For our COBT friends, viewers, and listeners, it's Maynard over in Lake Charles, Louisiana. I just took a picture of that bridge about 10 minutes ago. Great energy infrastructure over here. We're excited today to have Alex Zaslavsky. Alex is the co-founder and the managing partner of Horizon Engage. The firm was started in 2003. They do geopolitical risk and consulting, strategic consulting all around the planet. Alex's background in particular includes a lot of expertise in the former Soviet Union and all things related to that, as well as other things. And so when we were catching up with Alex the other day, we realized there's so many things to talk about, from Russia to Iran to Azerbaijan and the next COP and all kinds of geopolitical, strategic types of things in that part of the world that we got really excited. And Alex, thank you for agreeing to come on and talk with us about all that stuff.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, and another thing we're doing today is we've pressed into service one of our dear friends, Gabe Collins. Gabe's over at the Baker Institute. He's joined us before for some of these types of discussions from Moscow to Central Asia, around the Strait of Hormuz and into the Suez. Gabe knows it all, speaks it all. And so he is our first guest host. Gabe, thanks so much for joining us. We couldn't have a conversation that involved these types of players without getting you involved.
You're too kind. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
All right. Well, Mike Bradley, the market is always doing something, and you're always watching it. Tell us what's going on before we jump in with these guys.
Yeah, Maynard, unlike most weeks, I'm going to kind of keep it pretty short. I mean, I think today we had the PPI come out. It was around 0.5%, much hotter than expected. But really, bonds are yields are down. Stock market is kind of gone sideways, and I think it's because of Powell's over in Europe, and he's kind of talking a more dovish tone. But tomorrow is going to be a big, big day. CPI is tomorrow. Most expectations are around 0.4% or 3.4% year over year. And I think if that thing prints on the cooler side, you're going to see a massive market rally. You're going to see a massive bond rally. And I think if it's a little hotter than expected, it's probably not going to be as much downside as you expect. So I think the risk reward is really kind of tilted to, if you will, lower yields if the number comes out a little cooler tomorrow. So everyone's going to be focused on that. The broader market's going to be focused on that. A couple things I really want to talk about really is, I won't really focus on crude oil or natural gas this week. The thing I wanted to hit is copper. We haven't talked about copper in quite a bit of time, and copper today got over $5 a pound. It's an all-time high for copper. Really surpasses 2022 levels. And if you really look at the curve in copper, it's massively backwardated right now. It looks like there's a short squeeze going on in the front months. But the interesting thing about it is, if you look at the curve of copper over the last, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, it's really been in contango, and it's really in a backwardation state right now. So it's very interesting what's going on right now. It kind of says that there either is a short squeeze or there's demand is improving for that metal. So this is something we're thinking about. And the last thing I really wanted to talk about is, the last time Alexander was here, I believe was December 7th of 2021. And so I just want to give you an idea of what some commodity prices, markets were looking back then, and then we'll leave it there. Back then WTI was $72 a barrel. It's at $78 a barrel, so roughly $6 a barrel higher. Natural gas is at $3.70 m. It's $3.35 an m, so down a little bit. OPEC was producing 28 million barrels per day. It's at roughly 27 million barrels a day, so down about 1 million barrels per day. Saudi is around 9.9 million barrels, around 9.1 million barrels, so down about 0.9 million barrels per day. The US SPR was at 600 million barrels. Today it's 365 million barrels, so roughly 235 million barrels have been drained from the SPR. US oil production was 11.7 million barrels per day. It's 13.1 million barrels per day, so 1.4 million barrels per day higher. Natural gas production in the U.S. is roughly 97 BCF a day. It's 99 BCF a day today and coming lower, so roughly 2 BCF a day lower. And my bet is probably in the next 3 or 4 or 5 months, we're going to be probably down towards 97 BCF a day. So really, it hasn't grown. The 10-year bond was 1.5%. Today, the 10-year bond is at 4.5%, so 300 basis points higher. And two last stats, the S&P is up around 12% over that time, but the energy sector is up 65% over that time period. So with that, Maynard, we'll hand it back to you.
That's awesome, Mike. I always love it when you do that because, some things jump out at you, and the market, energy stocks, and of course that treasury number really jumps out at you. Alex, it's always fun to have you. I think what I was struck by the other day, we got on the phone and we started talking about Russia production, oil sanctions on Iran, Iranian friendship with Russia. Why is Azerbaijan hosting the next COP? And the next thing you know, we had this sort of Central Asian casserole of geopolitical things to talk about. You're helping people through that wide swath of the world. What jumps out at you right now? What's the main thing you're thinking about? What's occupying your time amongst all those? And I didn't even mention a war in Israel and Gaza. But what's occupying most of your time across that great big swath of territory?
It's really the impact of the war in Ukraine, Maynard, because the invasion upended the decade-long relationships, political and business deals that were in place, relationships between people, in our industry, people who invested years and decades of their lives into building projects in Russia, for example, were forced to leave at short notice. So we saw not just the human tragedy of the invasion, but really the massive business implications that really impacted people's lives in a variety of ways. And Azerbaijan is one of the countries that is on the periphery of the former Soviet Union, but right in the middle of all these conflicts that you mentioned. It's directly impacted by the war in Ukraine. It has closely aligned itself with Israel, and more importantly with Turkey. It has a very difficult relationship with Iran. And as a result of the war in Ukraine, it became a much more important player for Europe's energy security, taking Gazprom's market share, seeking ways to replace Gazprom as a major supplier of gas to Europe.
So there's so much in there. This is exactly what we were experiencing the other day when we were talking about. Let me grab one thing you mentioned and see if it's just an impression or if it's reality. I think a lot of people have this impression that when a lot of Western companies divested from Russian subsidiaries, whether it was McDonald's or oilfield service or you pick a name, that the Russians really kind of sort of just took over those businesses and were able to keep them going. Is that, I know that's a gross generalization, but what has happened to all those businesses that got left behind?
Depends on the business, but in most cases, where you have functioning assets that no longer require infusion of new technology, why not just take them over? It's a tragicomic example, but just a couple of weeks ago, Gazprom took over the washing machine businesses previously owned by Bosch and Ariston, the German and Italian home appliance manufacturers. It's one of the very strange ways in which Gazprom's poor profitability is now propped up, but it's a good enough example. It shows you, well, the assets are functioning. Why not? And of course, if you look at the consumer goods companies, it seems easy to keep them going for a little while. Inevitably, the quality degrades. Inevitably, they become different. But it's not dissimilar to Iran, right? I mean, if you're walking the streets of Tehran now, you'll see lots of brands that kind of mimic Western brands. So from the kind of consumer goods perspective, it's relatively easy. As far as energy is concerned, it has also not been terribly difficult, but primarily because Western service companies like Schlumberger and Halliburton built enormous pools of expertise in Russia. They were there for a very long time. They built very strong educational facilities, training generations of geophysicists, of reservoir engineers. So that has also been relatively straightforward to retain.
So one thing, Alex, you didn't say, but it was almost implied, or they made me curious as you were talking there about the consumer in Russia, or the family in Russia, or the average citizen in Russia, and the unfortunate pressure that they would be feeling as a result of Putin's actions. What is the man on the street sort of stress level associated with the war? Is it very high? Is it moderate? How would you characterize it?
Again, it depends upon where you find this man or woman. If you find him or her in Moscow or in a forgotten region somewhere in Siberia. But one incredible aspect of the war has been the infusion of cash in the poorer regions in Russia. So just to give you an example, if you volunteer, let's say, and join the Russian army, and you get killed, the state, if all goes well, pays your family probably about $200,000, right? And if you are in a region where an average salary is $200 a month, you can do the math and you see that the money that your family will make from your death in Ukraine far exceeds your lifetime earning capacity. And what we've seen is, so many people have been killed, is that you can actually spot the macroeconomic effect of this cash infusion in poorer regions. And people are buying houses, people are buying cars, people are spending more. And this is a really awful sort of byproduct of Putin's war. That he's kept all this money in the strategic reserve funds for the rainy day. That rainy day has arrived. At last, he's sharing some of this wealth with the poorer classes in Russia. But look at the context of that. And the human toll, which has been well documented, and it's easy to see and follow. The human toll has been absolutely incredible. Just to give you an example, the Russian army took a suburb of Donetsk, one of the major cities in east of Ukraine, that suburb named Avdiivka, which is quite difficult to find on a map. Actually, you need a magnifying glass. They took that suburb in February and March this year, and the number of soldiers and officers killed in the Russian army during that operation to take that suburb exceeded the number of casualties during the 10-year war in Afghanistan. Just to put things in perspective. So you see a lot of people getting killed, a lot of their relatives getting paid, and it's quite sort of a grotesque show.
Is it fair? I mean, that's such a perverse thing you're pointing out. Is it the case that, of course, the conflict in Gaza and in the Mideast, that this has maybe taken some of the attention off of the Ukraine, but it seems like in the early months, 6 to 12 months of the war, it seemed like the Russian people were increasingly pushing back. And now it feels like there's been some sort of that has calmed down and maybe even gone away. Is that the right way to interpret? I mean, you're giving us this monetary stat, which is crazy, but is that what's going on inside of Russia? Is the war more popular, or is there less resistance now than there was?
I think yes. The big reason for that is that a lot of people who opposed the war packed their bags and left. And especially in the first few months of the war, it was relatively easy to do it. A lot of people were spooked by the initial mobilization that was carried out in the kind of early, the first year of the war. So those who remained, either through necessity or through, being captured by the propaganda message. And, that's another critical element of this war, the propaganda messaging, the relentless propaganda that you get in Russia. They at least do not mind it that much. And you see various ways in which people adjust to it. Some pretend that it's just not their business, that they live their own lives and that war is somewhere else. Others buy into the propaganda narrative that it's not Russia that invaded Ukraine, but rather Russia is defending herself against the Western aggression. Anyway, we don't really see a lot of protest these days. Whatever small instances of protest we do notice, they get repressed very quickly. So from the viewpoint of domestic popular resistance, I think Putin is quite safe.
boy, there's so many questions. One that strikes me, we never really talk about it anymore, but the Prigozhin death, the uprising, the death, the fight, the whatever, that whole chapter, that also seems to have gone away. And you don't hear about the mercenary types prosecuting the war in Ukraine anymore. What is going on with that? Has that really gone away?
That's a great question, because it has not. The big news over the past few days was the replacement of Sergei Shoigu, quite a caricaturistic character, the defense minister who never really served in the army, but pretended he was a general and was sort of strutting around wearing dozens of medals. His replacement with a sort of gray-looking civilian economist. There are several reasons for that, but Prigozhin, the specter of Prigozhin, the ghost of that man, is actually a big reason, because Prigozhin came across as a wildly popular figure. He was a very outspoken, quite charismatic, incredibly rough and nasty character, but full of color, and really stood out among the sort of faceless ranks of people Putin surrounded himself with. His death sort of ensured Putin against the immediate risk of another mutiny. But the fame, the image of this popular figure never disappeared. So till this day, you hear a lot of references. If you read Russian media, especially social media, you hear a lot of references to Prigozhin as somebody who embodied the sort of hard truth about the war. You'll see the impact still.
Gabe, I want to pull you into this. You spend so much time thinking about, and as we kind of tour this part of the world, we'll try to stick on Ukraine and Russia for a minute. But what are some of the things you've been thinking about, wondering about, analyzing, etc.? And let's try to get you and Alex comparing notes on those things.
Certainly. I'll share a couple of those, and then I've actually a question for Alex based on some of the discussion that we just had. As I follow this, and maybe I'm kind of the odd duck that is simultaneously looking at oil barrels and tanks and missiles and kind of crossing the two over, it feels in some ways that we had a war that, at least from the outside, appeared almost stalemated for much of the past year. And there's a number of reasons for this, but it seems like now we're entering a much more dynamic phase. I mean, we see over the past couple of weeks, the Russians have made a move on the city of Kharkiv up in northeastern Ukraine and are taking territory. They're doing it in a way where they're paying a high price in blood and equipment for each square kilometer they get. But there's movement there. And on the Ukrainian side, we haven't yet seen the U.S. weapons that are funded by the security package that Congress recently passed haven't quite yet made it to the battlefield, but we know that's coming. Well, what we've seen in the interim is real development in Ukraine's indigenous strike capabilities. They're still not heavy, but we've seen drone raids in some cases over 1,000 kilometers into Russia. And we're seeing them start to demonstrate the ability to scale up and target in a sophisticated way. And the reason I bring this up in the escalation context is if we look at the energy war that's going on between Russia and Ukraine, we've seen the Russians pull out all the stops for quite some time, just wholesale destruction of power grid assets, of refineries and so forth. On the Ukrainian side, we've seen them target Russian refineries, and we've seen some instances of the bulk power system, electricity system being targeted, but there's many things that really haven't been touched yet. When you think about the oil export ports, the pumping stations and all the pipelines serving them, and other key nodes in the system, which if you imagine a 1,200 kilometer drone range, which is sort of the strike capability they've demonstrated so far, and you look at all the targets that fall within that radius and you see how little has actually been struck, it really, my own view is I expect some degree of escalation, probably beyond what we're comfortable with, at least in official circles in the United States in coming months.
And what you mentioned, you might want to throw something Alex's way around all that.
I do. And it comes back to this question. I think in some ways, you guys, as you talked, were almost describing the Wagnerization of Russia, where if we pay you enough, you'll be willing to go do horrible things in really remote, dangerous, and austere places. And my question to you, Alex, is we see this very macabre calculation that families out in Siberia, and I think down in parts of the Caucasus as well, places where you see a lot of Russia's military manpower come from, are basically making the calculation that, hey, for $200,000, even though we love you, you're essentially expendable because you'll buy us a house and set us up for a long time to come. Presumably, there's a bottom to this demographic barrel. How many more money-based mobilizations could we potentially see before the Russian society reaches a point where no matter how much money you throw, you just can't generate the manpower?
Great question, Gabe. I wish I could give you the precise number, but it looks like that pool of people is significant. I mean, Russia has a population of 140 plus million people. You need to draft people in their tens of thousands, probably not hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands at a time. So it's substantial. There is quite a bit of circumstantial evidence that this pool is not infinite. Just I look at efforts to draft migrants from Central Asia on various pretenses. For example, there is an odd contingent of Indian soldiers that or African soldiers that somehow find their way into eastern Ukraine. They tend to say that they were duped into signing some papers, and next thing they knew, they found themselves in the trench. So it does look like they are trying to scoop up whoever they can. But again, the population is large enough, and there's plenty of circumstantial evidence also that the volunteers, so to say, are in decent supply, even from Russia proper. And of course, you're right, from the poorest regions.
And I ask this question because as we think about how things play out on the US and the European side, is we know there's a far from infinite, in fact, very finite political appetite, it seems, for continuing security packages. And so as we sort of think, how does this play out over the next 12, 15, 18 months, is if you are able maybe to start seeing, again, some sort of bottom to that barrel, perhaps it changes the political tenor here in terms of being able to show people that this support's not required forever, but an intensified period over X months or say 2 years to come actually gets us closer to victory.
I wish it was the case. Again, unfortunately, on both sides, the incentives are misaligned, to my mind. I think Putin is completely comfortable with the war going on. In fact, to my mind, if he was given a choice of a victory parade in Kiev tomorrow versus the war of attrition for another 5 years, he would probably choose the latter. Going back to all those assets that are repossessed, they are repossessed by his friends and associates. So it's quite profitable for many people. His power has been propped up. There is no opposition. You say something or repost something that is not proper, you get arrested. So his rule, in other words, has been firmed up by the war. And of course, the minute the war ends, all these uncomfortable questions will creep to the surface, right? And all the people who are not paid, perhaps properly, who are not, who lost their lives, who are maimed, all of these things will emerge to haunt him on day one of the peace. And in the West as well, you talked about Russian barrels finding their ways to the global market. I think it would be unfair to say that the West has invested everything it could into that victory. Far from it, right? The West is addicted to Russian oil and gas. Russian gas isn't really sanctioned, as you know, at all. If you look at the consumption of countries in Southern Europe, in countries like France and Spain, they use more Russian gas than before the war. Russian oil finds its way quite easily to markets both in Europe and in Asia. And the help and the aid that the Ukraine receives from the West and from the US is just about enough to help it survive. So the best case scenario for Ukraine now, as we all know, is just surviving this year.
Certainly. And let me ask you a question following from that, because I think you've set it up very nicely, is there's a continuing demand going forward for Russian oil, and Russian oil is really the big source of federal budget revenues that underwrites their ability to stay in this war. But money alone is not sufficient. You need the industrial capacity, either within your country or within your allies, to turn that money into fighting capacity. What are your thoughts? Because as I look at this, it increasingly looks like an evolving contest between the NATO industrial base, primarily the US, but also our partners in Europe, and the industrial base in China. North Korea and Iran get the attention because they're sending lethal munitions in their completed form. But when you see how the Chinese industrial base, whether it's cars, whether it's semiconductors, all these other key materials that are just outside of what actually explodes and goes boom on the battlefield, seems to have been really critical in keeping Russia in the fight. What are your thoughts on how this situation between Russia and China has evolved?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the Russian economy and I guess people who have managed the Russian economy have displayed remarkable flexibility, working their ways around sanctions, getting what they need from China or from Iran, remarkably from North Korea. I think that's actually one of the most striking aspects of this war. So they've shown quite a lot of ability to prop up the military-industrial complex. Andrei Belousov, who I mentioned, the new Minister of Defense, last year was placed in charge of military drones production and did a relatively good job there. So you have a pool of quite capable people who are accustomed to finding their ways around sanctions. This is not the first sanctions that were thrown at them. You have a lot of people who worked for Rosneft, for example, in the past, who lifted oil out of Kurdistan, right? I mean, they have a lot of very rich experience. So I would say that their capacity is very impressive.
Do you think the West is too heavily reliant on sanctions in lieu of taking more aggressive steps on the military front, or taking more meaningful and aggressive steps to try to cut energy trade ties, for instance?
Again, I think the West is too big a concept, so we can't throw everybody in it. But
I'll narrow it down: the United States and the European Union.
In my personal opinion, the sanctions are half-hearted, kind of vacillating, and ultimately not very effective, because the loopholes and the exclusions are just too big to make them effective. They definitely work in some regards. They increase costs for Russia, for sure. They can target individual projects quite effectively. So if the intent is to throttle this or that pocket of the Russian energy sector, that in which foreign Western companies are involved, and there have been a few of them, that can be achieved. But as far as the big picture is concerned, is Putin really bothered by this thing? Does it really affect his ability to wage the war in a material way? It's not really at all clear. So then we have to ask ourselves a bigger question: what is the strategy of the Biden administration, of the European Union vis-a-vis Russia? And there we get into some really interesting territory, because you hear a lot of voices along the lines that Russia must not be allowed to win this war, right? But I also have a feeling that there's quite a bit of fear, not just of Russian victory, but of Russian defeat, because that opens up a Pandora's box of quite difficult future choices, and of course the risks of nuclear escalation is something that is in the back of everybody's mind. And then you end up, and then of course, I think especially in the US, but also in the EU, you have a whole class of Cold War era thinkers who ponder this, and they kind of think in the categories of strategic engagement or competition, but still dialogue with what used to be the Soviet Union and now Russia. And then, is this really a strategy for victory? I remember I was talking to Maynard the other day, and I remember from my student days, I took a class on military strategy, and the first thing you learn is Clausewitz's definition of victory, which is imposing your will on the enemy, right? But if we don't have that much will to impose, what kind of victory are we talking about here? So there too, we have rather toothless sanctions, and at the end of the day, quite foggy strategy to my mind, that as far as understanding what the end point of this is.
If NATO was to shift from being reactive, which I think is really where we are now, to being proactive, what are some of the centers of gravity that you would see as being effective areas for exerting real pressure on Russia to move toward something more like the Clausewitzian victory model you just described?
It's first of all, to my mind, providing Ukraine with the weapons that it needs. And this is even more important than the sanctions, to my mind. And there, if we look at the West, it really breaks down in a few pieces, because over the past 2.5 years, the Eastern European states, the Baltic states, and Poland, the ones who are right there, they have really supported giving Ukraine more and more weapons, more advanced weapons. And what happens is that they would say, okay, Ukraine needs tanks. Remember 2 years ago? And then the US administration would say, no, that's too much. That will cross the red line. That will, they'll provoke Putin. We can't do it. And then weeks in, months in, maybe the UK and France would support the Eastern Europeans' proposal that Ukraine needs a new class of weapons, tanks or long-range missiles, right? And then begrudgingly, eventually, the US administration will agree and will provide these weapons. But again, every time you see this kind of quite determined effort to state that we didn't want to be provocative. Just most recently, Jake Sullivan was talking about how these long-range missiles must not be used within Russia's territory. So it's very odd signaling, I must say.
You're saying we're coming out on a football field, but we're going to tell the other side we don't want to tackle you too hard.
That's right. We don't want you to win, for sure, but we won't tackle you too hard.
Can I ask you, Alex, because we have just seen, forgive the analogy, but we've just seen this type of attitude, if you will, with respect to the Israelis, where they've said, well, we're not going to give you that next shipment. Is there something, is there a theme there in how the administration approaches things, or are those two separate cases? And really, it's a not good analogy.
I think there are two separate cases, to be honest, because I think as far as the war in Gaza is concerned, the administration is aware of the risks where heavy bombs will be dropped on population centers to eliminate Hamas operatives, for example, and then collateral damage will be extraordinarily high. But there's a very odd jealousy and rivalry going on of sorts between Ukraine and Israel here, because if you listen to the Ukrainians, they will say, well, wait a minute, look at the incredible support Israel has received after the October the 7th attack. Look at this incredible pictures of all the incoming drones and missiles that Iran was throwing at Israel. Look at all of them being shut down. Why can't we get that? What's the difference, really? So, I think that from the lens of the Biden administration, the difference is quite significant. And I think that viewpoint is justified. But from the viewpoint of the Ukrainians, they were attacked in as barbaric and as egregious a way as Israel was, and yet they're receiving minimal support, they would say.
So one, it's sort of related, sort of not. It's in the neighborhood, but it's an interesting one you and I stumbled on the other day, which is Azerbaijan is going to host the next COP conference, which, as I understand it, it was like Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Belize were the three finalists. So like the Hatfields, the McCoys, and then, a Central American country. That was an interesting topic when we hit on it, because if you look at the map, and we'll pull it up, but the map of Azerbaijan, I mean, they're right there connected to Iran, Armenia, Russia. I mean, look at this for a neighborhood. This is quite a neighborhood. Talk to us a little bit about maybe it's the irony of Azerbaijan hosting the COP conference and what it looks like. Just all these bedfellows. There's so many unique relationships on this map.
Yeah.
Just tell us a little bit about this, if you would, Alex.
Well, the way COP host countries are selected is through geographical groups. And Azerbaijan weirdly belongs to the Eastern European group. And within that group, everybody hates everybody else, right? So it's kind of very difficult to agree on a candidate. I think as a result of that, I think Poland hosted COPs 3 times. Azerbaijan has been at war with Armenia, Russia is at war with Ukraine. Russia would veto any Eastern European state hosting a COP because they are allied against Russia. So Azerbaijan eventually was selected as the sort of perhaps the only place around which a compromise could be found. It's the neighborhood is incredible, and the geography here defines everything really, because absolutely you have Russia to the north, and you have quite a bit of oil transportation infrastructure. Baku to Novorossiysk pipeline going north. But unlike the Caspian states to the east, like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan has managed to build a proper energy bridge to the west. So since the 1990s, pipelines, both oil and gas, were built from Azerbaijan that enabled it to bypass Russia and to really disentangle itself early on from dependence on Russia. Compare this to Kazakhstan, that remains vitally dependent on Russia for the exports of its oil. Azerbaijan does not depend on Russia at all. But then there are, of course, other critical aspects of the geopolitical environment. Most importantly, the war with Armenia, because that has been the defining feature of Azerbaijan's politics for the past 30 years. There was a disputed territory that is within Azerbaijan's internationally recognized borders called Nagorno-Karabakh or Karabakh. Even the proper name for it is an issue that would be disputed by the parties. That bit of land was conquered by Armenia in the immediate aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and it was reconquered by Azerbaijan finally last year. And a lot of what's going on within the country, in Azerbaijan's government and politics, is defined by that reconquest.
These countries like Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, are they? Is it top of mind to them that they could be next to that the Russians, try to reincorporate them? Is that their mentality, or how do they view what's happening today?
Depends on the country. I think the risk is probably the highest in Kazakhstan because it has a significant ethnic Russian minority of probably 2 to 3 million people that predominantly live in the northwestern parts of Kazakhstan, close to Russia, so just above the Caspian Sea on this map here. And there's also the history of parts of Kazakhstan essentially being colonized by Russia in the 19th century. Some of the towns and cities in Kazakhstan initially had Russian names and have a history of very close connections to Russia. Azerbaijan is a little different. It's not as Russified culturally. It is more distinctly Turkic ethnically. You have more people speaking the Azeri language than you have in Kazakhstan speaking Kazakh. So culturally, ethnically, historically, it's better defined, so to say. But again, most importantly, it does not depend on Russia for its exports.
So, Alex, totally unfair question. As we look at this map, and you have two conflicts going on within the map, and we just did a preview of the trends in Ukraine and Russia. Well, I would say they're not good if you are hoping that Ukraine, does well. As you think about the potential outcomes of these two conflicts, how does it affect the rest of this map? What are some of the scenarios that you're worried about or thinking about? There's some interesting allegiances and alliances and rivalries on this map. The world keeps changing. What strikes you about what could happen here?
Well, I think it's worth talking about some positive developments. I mean, we're sort of accustomed to gloom and
yes.
And really kind of horrible things going on all around us. But that war with Armenia is over. There are now peace talks going on. I think the government in Azerbaijan is very keen to sign a peace deal with Armenia ahead of the COP29's launch in November. Just a new round of talks took place in the last few days. In Kazakhstan, no deals just yet, but it looks quite likely that a peace agreement of sorts will be signed. So that particular conflict looks like it is finally running its course. The risk, to my mind, is twofold. The way it has played out is that Putin has a much stronger relationship with Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, than he has with the purported Russian ally, Armenia, and its president, Nikol Pashinyan. And that's really a very striking aspect of this relationship, because this is where the personal ties come in front and center. We can talk about geopolitics, but geopolitics in many ways is defined by people who run those countries. And they are centralized authoritarian countries by and large. A very curious aspect of Azerbaijan's recent history has been Ilham Aliyev's ability to not just have a decent relationship with Putin, but have a proper friendship. So there are some reasons for it. There's a whole class of business figures of Azeri origin, quite wealthy entrepreneurs who are prominent in Russia, who help to maintain perhaps business links between the two presidents. But in any case, there's quite actually little risk of Putin intervening in Azerbaijan, because he has a genuinely good personal relationship with the president. And at the same time, he has complete disdain for the prime minister of Armenia. And Armenia formally is the Russian ally. The two countries have an official alliance. Armenia is part of the Russian-led customs union. And in theory, Russia should be supporting Armenia. And there are other cultural, religious reasons. Armenia is a Christian country. Azerbaijan is a Muslim one. So all of this would suggest that Russia should be on Armenia's side. And the exact opposite has been the case. So one risk factor, Maynard, returning to your question, is that there might be a peace deal between the two countries. But one just looking at Putin's conduct and looking at what Russian television says about Armenia, one would be forgiven for thinking that Putin wants to do something to the prime minister of Armenia, but he would not hold back from unseating him. And then the question is, if you're signing a peace deal, who are you signing it with? So the final observation is that the moment you sign a peace deal, there is really no role for Russia left. So that's why Putin likes those conflicts frozen, but he doesn't like them solved. So we'll see. We'll see. I think the coming months will show whether the two countries will sign a peace deal. I think they will, but I think there's also a risk that Putin will destabilize Armenia.
One of the things that really kind of perked my interest early in this call is when you talked about what's the definition of winning and losing. And I think that's an interesting concept, because I'm sure for Ukraine and Russia, there is a big difference there. There's also probably a big difference in Europe and the US. And to complicate matters, I mean, if Trump wins the presidency, it seems to me all the stuff he said over the last couple of years, and even he was proud about his presidency, saying there was no wars under my presidency and I'll make peace. So thinking about that, depending on the administration, what is winning and losing to both sides? What's winning and losing to us? And is there something that can be done here? Or are we going to be sitting there going, hey, we're going to go into Afghanistan, the U.S. in 2001. We're going to be there a couple of years, and then we're there 20 years, and no one really knows who won or lost, to be quite honest with you. I'm just trying to figure out, and I think the reason why that is because there was really the goalposts kept changing. And I guess my question is, can there be a peace? What does that look like? What's a win or loss from just maybe a Russia-Ukraine, but also from a U.S. standpoint, a European standpoint?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Again, a question without a ready-made easy answer. But if I were to point to one aspect of it, be it under Trump or Biden, I would just think about the credibility, the U.S. credibility and Western credibility, because if a country like Russia is allowed to invade its neighbor in complete disregard of international norms, commit war crimes, kill countless people, upend the global economic order, cause incredible disruptions and food supplies to parts of the world, blockade the Black Sea and prevent big countries in Africa from receiving the grain that they vitally need. If that is all allowed, that the promises that we will stand by you, that we will support you, for all of them turned out to be empty, that will set an incredibly dangerous precedent, because we can easily think about other countries that are learning from this war, and that will show other aspiring aggressors that you
Alex,
can get.
could I just ask you, while we're right on this point, aren't we showing, by starting to not really enforce the sanctions and by not being as aggressive militarily in terms of the aid and the restrictions, aren't we already kind of showing that Russia's getting away with it, or is that too harsh?
Yeah, it's completely fair, and again, I think in fairness, on both sides, huge mistakes have been made. I think predicting this war from the outset, was accompanied by lots of mistakes. Expectations of early Russian victory turned out to be wrong. Expectations of the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive. Expectations that the sanctions will be effective. So every popular or consensus view, let's say, so far has been proven wrong. But it's true. I think it is totally fair to say that by imposing those half-hearted sanctions, by defining those limits, by showing Putin that he can still sell his gas to Europe, right? But he can still sell oil. The enormous semi-formal we call it gray or apply any color you wanted, but there are enormous channels for the sale of Russian oil to Europe and refined products. They're still there. You have a very, to my mind, cumbersome and ineffective price cap mechanism, which might deprive Putin of some revenue, but the amount of money he's getting for the war effort is still very high. So all of this, of course, begs the question: how credible are the sanctions? How credible is this pressure?
Well, I didn't mean to distract you there. Mike did have a great question on how this thing might wrap up. Gabe, you spend so much time thinking about this part of the world. What you've heard some of Alex's comments around the broader region. What sticks out at you as we kind of get to the top of the hour?
Sure. So a couple of things. So I think when we think about the most consequential area, it seems like we're all pretty centered on that being the Russia-Ukraine war that's going on. Alex, I'm curious your reaction. This is something that I'm about to say will probably be viewed as fairly politically incorrect. And if it was something that was true, I would actually be ashamed of it as an American. But we talk about this lack of a strategy. What I've increasingly started to wonder as I watch our day late and 3 rocket short approach to supporting Ukraine is if there actually is a strategy and we're just not willing to articulate it because it's one that's rather Machiavellian and I think kind of terrible. It doesn't comport with our national values at some level. And that is we support them enough to seriously bloody our second most important near peer competitor after China, which is Russia. And I guess the reason I thought about this is I was asking myself over the last few weeks, is there anything that's happened to date that maybe we start to define as being beneficial to us? When you look at the level of losses the Russians have taken, if that's the metric you're using, this is something that they're pretty tremendous. What is your reaction to that? Because I hope this is something that's actually not reality, but I increasingly wonder.
I also, maybe I'm a bit naive, but I would find it hard to subscribe to this very sinister view that you just expressed, Gabe. Who knows? But at the end of the day, I think if we take that very sort of cynical calculation, of course this will not go on forever, and the Russian economy will not be able to take this indefinitely. It's following the path of the Soviet economy that eventually collapsed under the burden of the military expenditure and the endless war in Afghanistan. It's in that sense, absolutely, the Russian capabilities are getting eroded on any front. Economic, demographic, social, scientific. Russia is fast becoming a Chinese colony. It's just the fact. It's becoming vitally dependent on China in so many respects. So that's true. The problem is, of course, that it's a very kind of long-term calculation, and many years, unfortunately, may pass before that collapse takes place. The fact that will precipitate it as Putin's death. So there we have to sort of figure out how long he has left. And he seems to be in decent health and can definitely last another few years. So it's a tough calculation to make. And in the meantime, of course, the human tragedy in Ukraine, that is a daily event, makes this calculation even more sinister, right?
And I agree with you. And as somebody who's partially of Lithuanian descent, I'd be absolutely horrified if that is our calculation. But I've just started to wonder. I want to shift my next question a little bit. This is something I think is more fun and positive, and we're all energy and commodity people here at some level. The map that we were looking at a few minutes ago, one of the things that strikes me is we see Kazakhstan right now effectively landlocked for oil and gas exports. You either have to go through Russia or you have to go to China. Has there been any discussion of crossing the Caspian and utilizing these corridors that Azerbaijan has already pioneered, where you can get molecules to the Mediterranean, onto the ocean, or into Europe?
Quite a lot, Gabe, yes. Just a couple of months ago, President Tokayev, Kazakhstan's President Tokayev, was in Azerbaijan, by the way, celebrating the reconquest of those formerly occupied territories, opening Kazakh cultural centers in Karabakh, and in so many ways, really pushing this envelope of this friendship with Azerbaijan. But a big part of this friendship is increased tanker traffic across the Caspian. A few percent of Kazakh oil now finds its way across the Caspian to Azerbaijan. It's more expensive. It's logistically more challenging, but this emerging transportation corridor is a reality, and I think it's helping Kazakhstan. Because I think it's kind of similar to what countries like Poland or Baltic states experienced when they managed to disentangle themselves from dependence on Gazprom a few years ago. The minute you have an alternative channel, in those cases, channel of buying gas, you can negotiate with the monopoly or monopsony.
It redefines
more effective. It redefines your relationship.
Absolutely redefines your political reality.
Absolutely. And Kazakhstan is in that situation. Of course, it's looking to utilize the Caspian route, such as it is, as much as possible.
We might have to write a research brief on this.
Sure.
Alex, this is exactly what happened when we talked last week. You just gin up all these things. Let me, I hate to close it, but we probably have to. Alex, you got to get back to all these problems and studying them. So Baku, COP29. Alex, will you go?
I'll watch from a safe distance, I think.
Okay. So, but let's talk about, last question. Imagine what the world might look like by then. There's so many variables in play right now. And so that'll be in November. What's your, as you think about the end of the year and in Baku and COP29, what might be the flavor? What might be the discussion? What will be the effect of Azerbaijani leadership on COP29, and what might some other features of the world be?
Well, if I wear Gabe's cynical hat for a second, I think that November will be completely consumed by the US elections, because then, of course, that will suck all oxygen out of
it never comes up. No, nobody talks about it. It's just,
That's right. But as far as COP29 is concerned, look, I think the agenda is fairly straightforward. I mean, it's about the nationally determined contributions. It's about looking after the interests of smaller, more vulnerable states. So the talking points are not really different from the previous COPs, to my mind. I think a very practical challenge will be a logistical one. Azerbaijan is a small country. It has never hosted anything like this before. I think a big priority for President Aliyev is just to make sure that there are no catastrophes.
I think I saw somewhere that the country's about the size of Maine, and it's got 10 million people. So I mean, this is quite a place to hold this thing.
It'll be very different from Dubai for sure. So they are, they're doing a good enough job, it seems, so far, just building up infrastructure, but there's a lot. So the initial task will be just to make sure that logistically it works out.
Alex, I promised I wouldn't have one more, but I do have one last one, which is, when you look at that map and all these countries, is the World Bank a really influential financial institution, or what is the most influential financial institution in this broad swath of the world?
Again, it really depends on a country, because in some places, like Turkmenistan, which are completely isolated from the world, there's practically zero role for international financial institutions. And in places like this, the IMF actually plays a bigger role, because it's one of the very few outfits that reclusive governments still want to engage with. Other parts of the region in Central Asia have really opened up in recent years. So Uzbekistan has invited back international financial institutions. So outfits like the EBRD and the AGB are very active there, financing projects, including energy and renewables projects. Azerbaijan is a cash-rich place, so it's kind of less dependent on international financial institutions, and it's also looking for a path that makes it less dependent on Western financing, and it's kind of much more comfortable dealing with the Mahdas of this world, or perhaps with individual companies rather than the IFIs. So it depends on the country, Maynard.
Well, I think our takeaway from all this, Alex, is it's massively complicated, and we're just glad that you and Joe and everybody at Horizon are our friends, and that we can call and pick your brains, because there's so many things going on. It's stunning. Thanks
for the kind words, Maynard. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you and your colleagues. And Gabe, it's very nice to talk to you too. And it's been a wonderfully illuminating discussion, I think. Well, I tell you, between you two guys, Alex, you've been on the show 4 times. Gabe has joined us. I think this is your 3rd time. So this is like an all-star show right here. So you're too kind. Thank you. We really appreciate you. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Gabe. Thanks, Mike. Bye, everybody.